St Ethelstan's Church stood at the highest point of Knipe Hill, and if you chose to climb the tower you could see 10 miles or so across the surrounding country. Not that there was anything worth looking at, only the low, barely undulating East Anglian landscape, intolerably dull in summer, but redeemed in winter by the recurring pattern of the elms, naked and fan-shaped against the leaden skies. Immediately below you lay the town, with the high street running east to west and dividing it unequally. The southern section of the town was the ancient agricultural and respectable section. On the northern side were the buildings of the Biffle, Gordon sugar beet refinery, and all round and leading up to them were higgledy-piggledy rows of vile yellow brick cottages, mostly inhabited by the employees of the factory. The factory employees, who made up more than half of the town's 2,000 inhabitants, were newcomers, townsfolk, and godless almost to a man. The two pivots, or foci, about which the social life of the town moved were the Knipe Hill Conservative Club, fully licensed, from whose bow window, any time after the bar was open, the large, rosy-gilled faces of the town's elite were to be seen gazing, like chubby goldfish from an aquarium pane. And Ye Olde Tea Shop, a little further down the high street, the principal rendezvous of the Knipe Hill ladies, not to be present at Ye Olde Tea Shop between 10 and 11 every morning, to drink your morning coffee, and spend your half hour or so in that agreeable twitter of upper-middle-class voices. My dear, he had 9 spades to the ace-queen, and he went 1 no trump, if you please. What, my dear? You don't mean to say you're paying for my coffee again? Oh, no, but my dear, it is simply too sweet of you. Now tomorrow I shall simply insist on paying for yours. And just look at that dear little Toto, sitting up and looking such a clever little man with his little black nose waggling. And he would he, the darling duck? He would. And his mother would give him a lump of sugar, she would. There, Toto was to be definitely out of Knipe Hill society. The rector in his acid way nicknamed these ladies the Coffee Brigade. Close to the colony of sham picturesque villas inhabited by the Coffee Brigade, but cut off from them by its larger grounds, was the Grange, Miss Mayfield's house. It was a curious matchy-clotted imitation castle of dark red brick, somebody's folly, built around 1870, and fortunately almost hidden among dense shrubberies. The rectory stood halfway up the hill, with its face to the church, and its back to the high street. It was a house of the wrong age, inconveniently large, and faced with chronically peeling yellow plaster. Some earlier rector had added, at one side, a large greenhouse which Dorothy used as a workroom, but it was constantly out of repair. The front garden was choked with ragged fir trees, and a great spreading ash which shadowed the front rooms and made it impossible to grow any flowers. There was a large vegetable garden in the back. Progget did the heavy digging of the garden in the spring and autumn, and Dorothy did the sowing, planting, and weeding in such spare time as she would command, in spite of which the vegetable garden was an unusually impenetrable jungle of weeds. Dorothy jumped off a bicycle at the front gate, upon which some officious person had struck a poster inscribed, "Vote for Biffle Gordon and higher wages." There was a by-election going on, and Mr. Biffle Gordon was standing in the Conservative interest. As Dorothy opened the front door, she saw 2 letters lying on the worn coconut mat. One was from the rural dean, and the other was a nasty, thin-looking letter from Catkin and Palm, her father's clerical tailors. It was a bill, undoubtedly. The rector had followed his usual practice of collecting the letters that interested him and leaving the others. Dorothy was just bending down to pick up the letters when she saw, with a horrid shock of dismay, the unstamped envelope sticking in the letter flap. It was a bill, for certain it was a bill. Moreover, as soon as she set eyes on it, she knew it was that terrible bill from Cargill's, the butcher's. A sinking feeling passed through her entrails. For a moment she actually began to pray that it might not be Cargill's bill, but it might only be the bill for 3 and 9 from Soul Pipes, the drapers, or the bill from the International, or the bakers, or the dairy, anything except Cargill's bill. Then, mastering her panic, she took the envelope from the letter flap and tore it open with a convulsive movement. To account rendered £21, 7 shillings and 9 pence. This was written in the innocuous handwriting of Mr. Cargill's accountant, but underneath, in thick, accusing letters, was added and heavily underlined, "Should like to bring your notice that this bill has been owing a very long time. The earliest possible settlement will oblige S. Cargill." Dorothy had turned a shade paler, and was conscious of not wanting any breakfast. She thrust the bill into her pocket, and went into the dining room. It was a smallish dark room, badly in need of repapering, and like every other room in the refectory, it had an air of having been furnished from the sweepings of an antique shop. The furniture was good, but battered beyond repair, and the chairs were so worm-eaten that you could only sit on them in safety if you knew their individual foibles. There were old, dark, defaced steel engravings hanging on the walls, one of them an engraving of Van Dyck's portrait of Charles I, probably of some value if it had not been ruined by the damp. The rector was standing before the empty grate, warming himself at an imaginary fire, and reading a letter that came from a long blue envelope. He was still wearing his cassock of black wadded silk, which set off to perfection his thick, white hair, and his pale, fine, none too amenable face. As Dorothy came in, he laid the letter aside, drew out his gold watch, and scrutinized it significantly. "I'm afraid I'm a bit late, Father." "Yes, Dorothy, you are a bit late," said the rector, repeating her words with delicate but marked emphasis. "You are 12 minutes late, to be exact. Don't you think, Dorothy, that when I have to get up at 5:45 to celebrate Holy Communion, and come home exceedingly tired and hungry, it would be better if you could manage to come to breakfast without being a bit late?" It was clear that the rector was in what Dorothy called, euphemistically, his uncomfortable mood. He had one of those weary, cultivated voices which are never definitely angry, and never anywhere near good humour, one of those voices which seem all the while to be saying, "I really cannot see what you are making all this fuss about." The impression he gave was of suffering perpetually from other people's stupidity and tiresomeness. "I'm so sorry, Father. I simply had to go and ask for Miss Trelawney. Her baby was born last night, and you know she promised me she'd come and be churched after it was born. But of course she won't if she thinks we aren't taking any interest in her. You know what these women are like. They seem so to hate being churched. They'll never come unless I coax them into it." The rector did not actually grunt, but he uttered a small, dissatisfied sound as he moved towards the breakfast table. It was intended to mean, first, that it was Mrs. Tawney's duty to come and be churched without Dorothy's coaxing. Secondly, that Dorothy had no business to waste her time visiting all the riffraff of the town, especially before breakfast. Mrs. Tawney was a labourer's wife, who lived in Partibus Infidelium, north of the High Street. The rector laid his hand on the back of his chair, and without speaking, cast Dorothy a glance which meant, "Are we ready now? Or are there to be any more delays?" "I think everything's here, Father," said Dorothy. "Perhaps if you'd just say grace." "Benedictus benidat," said the rector, lifting the worn silver coverlet of the breakfast stash. The silver coverlet, like the silver gilt marmalade spoon, was a family heirloom. The knives and forks, and most of the crockery came from Woolworth's. "Bacon again, I see," the rector added, eyeing the 3-minute rashers that lay curled up on squares of fried bread. "It's all we've got in the house, I'm afraid," Dorothy said. The rector picked up his fork between finger and thumb, and with a very delicate movement, as though playing at spillikins, turned one of the rashers over. "I know, of course," he said, "that bacon for breakfast is an English institution, almost as old as parliamentary government, but still, don't you think that we might occasionally have a change, Dorothy?" "Bacon's so cheap now," said Dorothy regretfully. "It seems a sin not to buy it. This was only 5 pence a pound, and I saw some quite decent-looking bacon as low as 3 pence. Ah, Danish, I suppose. What a variety of Danish invasions we have had in this country. First with fire and sword, and now with our abominable cheap bacon. Which has been responsible for more deaths, I wonder?" Feeling a little better after this witticism, the rector settled himself in his chair, and made a fairly good breakfast of the despised bacon, while Dorothy, she was not having any bacon this morning, a penance she had set herself yesterday for saying damn, and idling for half an hour after lunch, meditated on a good conversational opening. There was an unspeakably hateful job in front of her, a demand for money. At the very best of times, getting money out of her father was next door to impossible, and it was obvious that this morning he was going to be even more difficult than usual. Difficult was another one of her euphemisms. He's had bad news, I suppose, she thought despondently, looking at the blue envelope. Probably no one who had ever spoken to the rector for as long as 10 minutes would have denied that he was a difficult kind of man. The secret of his almost unfailing ill humour really lay in the fact that he was an anachronism. He ought never to have been born in the modern world. Its whole atmosphere disgusted and infuriated him. A couple of centuries earlier, a happy pluralist, writing poems or collecting fossils while curates at £20 an hour administered his parishes, he would have been perfectly at home. Even now, if he had been a richer man, he might have consoled himself by shutting the 20th century out of his consciousness. But to live in past ages is very expensive. You can't do it on less than 2,000 a year. The rector, tethered by his poverty to the age of Lenin and the Daily Mail, was kept in a state of chronic exasperation, which it was only natural that he should work off on the person nearest to him. Usually, that is, on Dorothy. He had been born in 1871, the younger son of the younger son of a baronet, and had gone into the church for the outmoded reason that the church was the traditional profession for younger sons. His first cure had been in a large, slummy parish in East London, a nasty, hooliganish place it had been, and he looked back on it with loathing. Even in those days the lower classes, as he made a point of calling them, were getting decidedly out of hand. It was a little better when he was curate in charge at some remote place in Kent. Dorothy had been born in Kent, while the decidedly downtrodden villagers still touched their hats to parson. But by that time he had married, and his marriage had been diabolically unhappy. Moreover, because clergymen must not quarrel with their wives, its unhappiness had been secret, and therefore 10 times worse. He had come to Knipe Hill in 1908, aged 37, and with a temper incurably scored, a temper which had ended by alienating every man, woman, and child in the parish. It was not that he was a bad priest, merely as a priest. In his purely clerical duties he was scrupulously correct. Perhaps a little too correct for a low church East Anglian parish. He conducted his services with perfect taste, preached admirable sermons, and got up at uncomfortable hours of the morning to celebrate Holy Communion every Wednesday and Friday. But that a clergyman has any duties outside the four walls of a church was a thing that had never seriously occurred to him. Unable to afford a curate, he left the dirty work of the parish entirely to his wife, and after her death, she died in 1921, to Dorothy. People used to say, spitefully and untruly, that he would have let Dorothy preach his sermons for him, if it had been possible. The lower classes had grasped from the first what was his attitude towards them. If he had been a rich man, they probably would have licked his boots, according to their custom. As it was, they merely hated him. Not that he cared whether they hated him or not, for he was largely unaware of their existence. But even with the upper classes he was no better. With the county he had quarrelled one by one, and as for the petty gentry of the town, as the grandson of a baronet he despised them, and was at no pains to hide it. In 23 years he had succeeded in reducing the congregation of St. Athelstan's from 600 to something under 200. This was not solely due to personal reasons. It was also because the old-fashioned high Anglicanism to which the rector ostensibly clung was of a kind to annoy all parties in the parish about equally. And nowadays, a clergyman who wants to keep his congregation has only 2 courses open to him. Either it must be Anglo-Catholicism, pure and simple, or rather pure and not simple, or he must be daringly modern and broad-minded, and preach comforting sermons proving that there is no hell, and all good religions are the same. The rector did neither. On the one hand, he had the deepest contempt for the Anglo-Catholic movement. It had passed over his head, leaving him absolutely untouched. Roman fever was a name for it. On the other hand, he was too high for the other members of his congregation. From time to time he scared them almost out of their wits by the use of the fatal word Catholic, not only in its sanctified place in the creeds, but also from the pulpit. Naturally the congregation dwindled year by year, and it was the best people who were to go first. Lord Puckthorne of Puckthorne Court, who owned 1/5 of the county, Mr. Levis, the retired leather merchant, Sir Edward Howson of Crabtree Hill, and such of the petty gentry that owned motor cars had all deserted St. Athelstan's. Most of them drove over on Sunday mornings to Millborough, 5 miles away. Millborough was a town of 5,000 inhabitants, and you had your choice of 2 churches, St. Edmund's and St. Wedekinds. St. Edmund's was modernist, text from Blake's Jerusalem blazoned over the altar, and communion wine out of liquor glasses, and St. Wedekinds was Anglo-Catholic, and in a state of perpetual guerrilla warfare with the bishop. But Mr. Cameron, the secretary of Knipe Hill Conservative Club, was a Roman Catholic convert, and his children were in the thick of the Roman Catholic literary movement. They were said to have a parrot, which they were teaching to say, "Et cetera ecclesiam nulla salus." In effect, no one of any standing remained true to St. Athelstan's, except Miss Mayfell of the Grange. Most of Miss Mayfell's money was bequeathed to the church, so she said. Meanwhile, she had never been known to put more than 6pence in the collection bag, and she seemed likely to go on living forever. The first 10 minutes of breakfast passed in complete silence. Dorothy was trying to summon up courage to speak. Obviously she had to start some kind of conversation before raising the money question. But her father was not an easy man with whom to make small talk. At times he would fall into such deep fits of abstraction you could hardly get him to listen to you. At other times he was all too attentive, listened carefully to what you said, and then pointed out, rather wearily, that it was not worth saying. Polite platitudes, the weather, and so forth, generally moved him to sarcasm. Nevertheless, Dorothy decided to try the weather first. "It's a funny kind of day, isn't it?" she said, unaware, even as she made it, of the inanity of this remark. "What is funny?" inquired the rector. "Well, I mean, it was so cold and misty this morning, and now the sun's came out, and it's turned quite fine." "Is there anything particularly funny about that?" That was no good, obviously. He must have had bad news, she thought. She tried again. "I do wish that you'd come out and have a look at the things in the back garden sometime, Father. The runner beans are doing so stupendously. The pods are going to be over a foot long, and we want to keep all the best of them for the Harvest Festival, of course. I thought it would look so nice if we decorated the pulpit with festoons of runner beans, and a few tomatoes hanging in among them." This was a faux pas. The rector looked up from his plate with an expression of profound distaste. "My dear Dorothy," he said sharply, "is it necessary to begin worrying me about the Harvest Festival already?" "I'm sorry, Father," said Dorothy, disconcerted. "I don't mean to worry you. I just thought—" "Do you suppose," proceeded the rector, "it is any pleasure to me to have to preach my sermon among festoons of runner beans? I'm not a greengrocer. It quite puts me off my breakfast to think of it. When is the wretched thing due to happen?" "It's September the 16th, Father." "That's nearly a month hence. For heaven's sake, let me forget it a little longer. I suppose we must have this ridiculous business once a year to tackle the vanity of every amateur gardener in the parish. But don't let's think of it more than is absolutely necessary." The rector had, as Dorothy ought to have remembered, a perfect abhorrence of harvest festivals. He had even lost a valuable parishioner, a Mr. Tygos, a surely retired market gardener, through his dislike, as he said, of seeing his church dressed up to imitate a coster's stall. Mr. Tygos, anima naturalita nonconformistica, had been kept church solely by the privilege, at Harvest Festival time, of decorating the side altar with a sort of Stonehenge composed of gigantic vegetable marrows. The previous summer he had succeeded in growing a perfect leviathan of a pumpkin, a fiery red thing so enormous that it took 2 men to lift it. This monstrous object had been placed in the chancel, where it dwarfed the altar and took all the colour out of the east window. No matter what part of the church you were standing, the pumpkin, as the saying goes, hit you in the eye. Mr. Tygos was in raptures. He hung about the church at all hours, unable to tear himself away from his adored pumpkin, and even bringing relays of friends in to admire it. From the expression of his face, you would have thought he was quoting Wordsworth on Westminster Bridge. "Earth has not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty." Dorothy even had hopes, after this, of getting him to come to Holy Communion, but when the rector saw the pumpkin he was seriously angry, and ordered that revolting thing, to be removed at once. Mr. Tygos had instantly gone chapel, and he and his heirs were lost to the church forever. Dorothy attempted to make one final attempt at conversation. "We're getting on with the costumes for Charles I," she said. "The church school children were rehearsing a play entitled Charles I in aid of the organ fund. But I do wish we'd chosen something a bit easier. The armour is a dreadful job to make, and I'm afraid the jackboots are going to be worse. I think next time we must really have a Roman or Greek play, something where they only have to wear togas." This elicited only another muted grunt from the rector. School plays, pageants, bazaars, jumble sales, and concerts in aid of were not quite so bad in his eyes as harvest festivals, but he did not pretend to be interested in them. They were necessary evils, he used to say. At this moment Ellen, the maid-servant, pushed open the door and came grouchily into the room with one large, scaly hand holding her sacking apron against her belly. She was a tall, round-shouldered girl, with mouse-coloured hair, a plaintive voice, and a bad complexion, and she suffered chronically from eczema. Her eyes flitted apprehensively towards the rector, but she addressed herself to Dorothy, for she was much too afraid of the rector to speak to him directly. "Please, miss," she began. "Yes, Ellen?" "Please, miss," went on Ellen plaintively. "Mr. Porter's in the kitchen. He says please could the rector come round and baptize Miss Porter's baby, because I don't think it's going to live a day out, and it ain't been baptized yet, miss." Dorothy stood up. "Sit down," said the rector promptly, with his mouth full. "What do they think is the matter with the baby?" said Dorothy. "Well, miss, it's turning quite black, and it's had the diarrhea, something cruel." The rector emptied his mouth with an effort. "Must I have these disgusting details while I'm eating my breakfast?" he exclaimed. He turned on Ellen. "Send Porter about his business, and tell him I'll be round his house at 12 o'clock. I really cannot think why it is that the lower classes always seem to choose meal times to come pestering one," he added, casting another irritated glance at Dorothy as she sat down. Mr. Porter was a labouring man, a bricklayer to be exact. The rector's views on baptism were entirely sound. If it had been urgently necessary, he would have walked 20 miles through snow to baptize a dying baby. But he did not like to see Dorothy proposing to leave the breakfast table at the call of a common bricklayer. There was no further conversation during breakfast. Dorothy's heart was sinking faster and faster. The demand for money had got to be made, and yet it was perfectly obvious that it was foredoomed to failure. His breakfast finished, the rector got up from the table and began to fill his pipe with a tobacco jar on the mantelpiece. Dorothy uttered a short prayer for courage, and then pinched herself. "Go on, Dorothy, out with it. No funking, please." With an effort she mastered her voice and said, "Father? Father?" "What is it?" said the rector, pausing with the match in his hand. "Father, I've got something I want to ask you, something important." The expression on the rector's face changed. He had divined instantly what she was going to say, and, curiously enough, he now looked less irritable than before. A stony calm had settled upon his face. He looked like a rather exceptionally aloof and unhelpful sphinx. "Now, my dear Dorothy, I know very well what you are going to say. I suppose you are going to ask me for money again, is that it?" "Yes, father, because, well, I may as well save you the trouble. I have no money at all. Absolutely no money at all until the next quarter. You have had your allowance, and I cannot give you a halfpenny more. It is quite useless to come worrying me now." "But, father—" Dorothy's heart sank yet lower. What was worst of all when she came to him for money was the terrible, unhelpful calmness of his attitude. He was never so unmoved as when you were reminding him that he was up to his eyes in debt. Apparently he could not understand that tradesmen occasionally want to be paid, and that no house can be kept going without an adequate supply of money. He allowed Dorothy £18 a month for all the household expenses, including Ellen's wages, and at the same time he was dainty about his food, and instantly detected any falling off in its quality. The result was, of course, that the household was permanently in debt, but the rector paid not the slightest attention to his debts. Indeed, he was hardly even aware of them. When he lost money over an investment, he was deeply agitated. But as for a debt to a mere tradesman, well, it was the kind of thing that he simply could not bother his head about. A peaceful plume of smoke floated upwards from the rector's pipe. He was gazing with a meditative eye at the steel engraving of Charles I, and had probably forgotten already about Dorothy's demand for money. Seeing him unconcerned, a pang of desperation went through Dorothy, and her courage came back to her. She said more sharply than before, "Father, please listen to me. I must have some money soon. I simply must. We can't go on as we're doing. We owe money to nearly every tradesman in the town. It's got so that some mornings I can hardly bear to go down the street and think of all the bills we owe. Do you know that we owe Corgill nearly £22? "What of it?" said the rector, between puffs of smoke. "But the bill's been mounting up over 7 months. He sent it in over and over again. We must pay it. It's so unfair to him to keep him waiting for his money like that." "Nonsense, my dear child. These people expect to be kept waiting for their money. They like it. It brings them more in the end. Goodness knows how much I owe to Cacton and Bam. I should hardly care to inquire. They are dunning me at every post, but you don't hear me complaining, do you? But, Father, I can't look at it as you do. I can't. It's so dreadful to be always in debt. Even if it isn't actually wrong, it's so hateful. It makes me so ashamed. When I go to Cargill's shop to order the joint, he speaks to me so shortly, and makes me wait after the other customers, all because our bill's mounting up the whole time, and yet I daren't stop ordering from him. I believe he'd run us in if I did." The rector frowned. "What? Do you mean to say the fellow has been impertinent to you?" "I don't say he's been impertinent, Father, but you can't blame him if he's angry when his bill's not paid." "I most certainly can't blame him. It is simply abominable how these people take it upon themselves to behave nowadays. Abominable. But there you are, you see. That is the kind of thing that we are exposed to in this delightful century. That is democracy, progress, as they are so pleased to call it. Don't order from that fellow again. Tell him at once that you are taking your account elsewhere. It's the only way to treat these people." "But, Father, that doesn't settle anything. Really and truly, don't you think we ought to pay him? Surely we can get a hold of the money somehow. Can't you sell out some shares or something?" "My dear child, don't talk to me about selling out shares. I have just had the most disagreeable news from my broker. He tells me that my Sumatra tin shares have dropped from 7 and 4 pence to 6 and a penny. It means a loss of nearly £60. I am telling him to sell it out at once, before they drop any further." "Then if you sell out, you'll have some ready money, won't you? Don't you think it would be better to get out of debt once and for all?" "Nonsense, nonsense," said the rector more calmly, putting his pipe back into his mouth. "You know nothing whatsoever of these matters. I shall have to reinvest at once in something more hopeful. It's the only way of getting my money back." With one thumb in the belt of his Cossack, he frowned abstractedly at the steel engraving. His broker had advised United Salonisi. Here in Sumatra Tin, United Salonisi, and numberless other remote and dimly imagined companies, was the central cause of the rector's money troubles. He was an inveterate gambler. Not, of course, that he thought of it as gambling. It was merely a lifelong search for a good investment. On coming of age, he had inherited £4,000, which had gradually dwindled, thanks to his investments, to about 1,200. What was worse, every year he managed to scrape together, out of his miserable income, another £50 which vanished by the same road. It was a curious fact that the lure of a good investment seems to haunt clergymen more persistently than any other class of men. Perhaps it is the modern equivalent of the demons in female shape who used to haunt the anchorites of the Dark Ages. "I shall buy 500 United Celants," said the rector, finally. Dorothy began to give up hope. Her father was now thinking of his investments. She knew nothing whatsoever about these investments, except that they went wrong with phenomenal regularity. And in another moment, the question of the shop debts would have slipped entirely out of his mind. She made a final effort. "Father, let's get this settled, please. Do you think you'll be able to let me have some extra money fairly soon? Not this moment, perhaps, but in the next month or two?" "No, my dear, I don't. About Christmas time, possibly. It's very unlikely even then. But for the present, certainly not. I haven't a halfpenny I can spare." "But, Father, it's so horrible to feel that we can't pay our debts. It disgraces us so. Last time Mr. Willow and Foster was here," Mr. Willow and Foster was the rural dean, Miss Willow and Foster was going all around town, asking everyone the most personal questions about us. Asking how we spent our time, how much money we had, and how many tons of coal we used each year, and everything. She's always trying to pry into our affairs. Suppose she found out we were really badly in debt? Surely that is our own business. I fail entirely to see what it has to do with Miss Willow and Foster, or anyone else. But she'd repeat it all over the place. And she'd exaggerate too. You know what Miss Willow and Foster's like. In every parish she goes to, she tries to find out something disgraceful about the clergyman, and then she repeats every word of it to the bishop. I don't want to be uncharitable about her, but really realizing that she did want to be uncharitable, Dorothy was silent. She is a detestable woman, said the rector evenly. What of it? Who ever heard of a rural dean's wife who wasn't detestable? But father, I don't seem to be able to get you to see how serious things are. We've simply nothing to live on for the next month. I don't know where the meat's coming from for today's dinner. Luncheon, Dorothy, luncheon, said the rector, with a touch of irritation. I do wish you would drop that abominable lower-class habit of calling the midday meal dinner. For luncheon, then. Where are we to get the meat from? I daren't ask Cargill for another joint. Go to the other butcher. What's his name? Salter? And take no notice of Cargill. He knows he'll be paid sooner or later. Good gracious. I don't know what all the fuss is about. Doesn't everyone owe money to his tradesmen? I distinctly remember. The rector straightened his shoulders a little, and putting his pipe back into his mouth, looked into the distance. His voice became reminiscent and perpetually more agreeable. I distinctly remember that when I was up at Oxford, my father had still not paid some of his own Oxford bills of about 30 years earlier. Tom was the rector's cousin, the baronet. Tom owed 7,000 before he came into his money. He told me so himself. At that, Dorothy's last hope vanished. When her father began to speak about his cousin Tom, and about things that had happened when I was up at Oxford, there was nothing more to be done with him. It had meant that he had slipped into an imaginary golden past in which such vulgar things as butcher's bills simply did not exist. There were long periods together when he seemed to actually forget that he was only a poverty-stricken country rector, that he was not a young man of family with estates and reservations at his back. The aristocratic, the expensive attitude was the one that in all circumstances came the most naturally to him. And of course while he lived, not uncomfortably, in the world of his imagination, it was Dorothy who had to fight the tradesman and make the leg of mutton last from Sunday to Wednesday. But she knew the complete uselessness of arguing with him any longer. It would only end up making him angry. She got up from the table and began to pile the breakfast things into the tray. You're absolutely certain that you can't let me have any money, father? She said for the last time, at the door, with the tray in her arms. The rector, gazing into the middle distance, amid comfortable wreaths of smoke, did not hear her. He was thinking, perhaps, of his golden Oxford days. Dorothy went out of the room distressed, almost to the point of tears. The miserable question of the debts was once more shelved, as it had been shelved a few thousand times before, with no prospect of final solution.